the greatest knight of all time. The man who brought glory to Camelot, and who, for love, destroyed it. His story didn't begin with a sword or a throne, but in a lake. Today I'll tell you how the fate of King Arthur and his kingdom was sealed the day a baby was given to the Lady of the Lake. His father, King Ban of Benoic, watched his kingdom burn and stopped at the edge of a lake. Grief consumed him. He died upon seeing his castle in flames, leaving his wife, Queen Elaine, with a broken heart and a defenseless baby in her arms. It was then that an ethereal figure emerged from the depths, the Lady of the Lake. With a supernatural beauty and a compassion not of this world, she approached the queen. Elaine, on the verge of despair and feeling her own imminent death, made the only decision possible to save her lineage. She gave her young son Lancelot to the lady, entrusting his destiny to the magical waters. The Lady of the Lake accepted the child. She took him to her underwater kingdom, a place of crystal and light invisible to mortals. There, Lancelot would not only learn the arts of the sword and shield but also the mysteries of magic, courtesy, and chivalry that few mortals would ever master. On the surface, the world continued on, ignorant that the greatest knight they would ever see was being forged in the silence of the depths. The Lady of the Lake was his mother, his mentor, and his guide, instilling in him a code of honor that was as pure as the water of her home. But the Lady of the Lake could not protect him from his destiny. She knew that Lancelot, the child who had lost everything, was destined to find a new purpose. A purpose that would lead him to a castle called Camelot, where a forbidden love awaited him. A love that, while born in the light, would ignite the spark of destruction for the greatest kingdom the world had ever known. To understand Lancelot, it is essential to understand the figure who molded him, the entity that pulled him from the depths of sorrow to forge him into a weapon of justice and honor, the Lady of the Lake. Her name was Ninian or Vivian depending on the legend. She was no mere mortal but a being of an ancient lineage, a guardian of the secrets that lay at the edges of the known world and the world of magic. The waters of her lake were not just a body of water. They were a portal to another realm, a place where time flowed differently and where wisdom was passed down through the ages. From the moment she accepted Lancelot, the Lady of the Lake became his mother. She fed him, protected him, and, most importantly, educated him. Beneath the water, in her kingdom of crystal and light, Lancelot learned the skills of a knight. But his training went far beyond mere swordsmanship or horsemanship. The lady taught him to read the stars, to understand the laws of nature, and to feel the flow of magic in the world. She instilled in him a code of honor that was as pure as the water of her home. She taught him to protect the innocent, to be loyal to his vows, and not to yield to cowardice. These lessons would be etched onto Lancelot's soul, becoming the foundation of his identity as a knight. The lady instructed him in the art of the sword, but not just to kill, but to defend. She gave him his first weapon, a sword imbued with her own magic, which would fit perfectly in his hand. She taught him to ride a horse, but insisted that his true steed would be his own courage. His training was exhaustive and solitary. Lancelot grew up without the bustle of a court, without the jealousy of other knights, without political intrigues. His only company was the lady and the beings of her kingdom, which gave him a purity of heart that would make him unique in the world of men. However, the lady's love for her protégé was not blind. She knew of Lancelot's destiny. She knew that one day he would have to leave the peace of the lake to face the storms of the human world. She prepared him for that trial, but also warned him about the temptations he would find. She spoke of ambition, of envy, and, above all, of the dangers of carnal love that could corrupt the purity of his soul. The lady was wise, and her wisdom told her that Lancelot's greatest challenge would not be a dragon or an enemy on the battlefield, but a human emotion, a longing that would break all his vows. When Lancelot reached adulthood, he felt the call of adventure, the desire to prove his worth in the world of mortals. The Lady of the Lake watched him leave with a mixture of pride and sadness. She knew her time with him was over, and that destiny had a different plan for him. She gave him her final blessing and a magical ring that would protect him from illusions. But the lady knew she could not protect him from the greatest of all illusions, the one the heart creates for itself. Lancelot, the young man who had been raised by magic, left his aquatic home to seek his place among men. On the surface he was nothing more than a knight seeking adventure. But within him, he carried the lessons of the Lady of the Lake, the purity of his training, and the shadow of his destiny. The world was about to meet a knight without equal, a warrior whose heart, though pure in its origin, would be torn apart by the very passion that would make him legendary. With the blessing of the Lady of the Lake, the young Lancelot emerged into the world of men, a realm of sun and shadows that was both fascinating and brutal. He was no simple boy. He was a knight, forged by magic and solitude, with a purity of heart that made him a stranger to worldly intrigues. His first step was a journey of self-discovery, a quest to prove his worth and find his place in an unknown world. He had no kingdom to return to nor a family to turn to. His only guide was the code of chivalry the lady had instilled in him. His first years in the outside world were a whirlwind of adventures. He traveled through villages and castles, facing bandits and knights who had strayed from the path of honor. His deeds became legendary. It is said that his sword never rested until justice was served, and that his shield was always ready to protect the innocent. He did not fight for fame or fortune, but for the simple desire to do good. This purity of intent made him even more formidable. Unlike other knights who often took pride in their names or lineages, Lancelot simply introduced himself as the Knight of the Lake, his origin a mystery that only added to his aura of legend. In every battle, in every tournament, he demonstrated superhuman skill. His prowess with the sword was unmatched. His speed and strength were worthy of a hero of antiquity. He defeated adversaries who seemed invincible and rescued maidens from dragons and enchanted castles. These victories not only built his reputation but also prepared him for the great destiny that awaited him. Every fight was a lesson, every wound a teaching. He was not only perfecting his fighting skills but also his character, learning to balance his strength with piety and his honor with humility. News of his exploits spread by word of mouth. Bards sang his songs, and common people spoke of an unparalleled knight who appeared from nowhere to defend the downtrodden. The name Lancelot began to be synonymous with nobility and courage. But despite all his victories, despite the fame that surrounded him, there was a loneliness in his heart. He did not belong anywhere. He had no court to report to, no king to serve. The Lady of the Lake had prepared him to be a champion, but the solitude of his fate followed him like a shadow. The world, however, had a place prepared for him. Somewhere, a king of great renown was uniting the nation, creating a new ideal of chivalry. The legend of that king, Arthur, and his round table was beginning to spread throughout the land. Lancelot, the solitary knight, felt the call. It was not just the promise of adventure, but the hope of finding a greater purpose, of being part of something bigger than himself. His path would lead him to a place of peace and honor, a place called Camelot. But it would also lead him to the greatest challenge of his life. A love that would test every fiber of his being and ultimately break everything he swore to defend. Driven by the stories of a just kingdom and a visionary king, Lancelot set out for Camelot. It was not just a castle, it was the center of an ideal, the heart of a kingdom that promised peace and justice for all. When his eyes fell upon the imposing towers and white stone walls, he knew he had reached his destiny. A place where his skill would be valued and his honor respected. His fame had preceded him. The people of Camelot had already heard of the enigmatic Knight of the Lake. But the true test came when he presented himself before King Arthur. In the great throne room, surrounded by the bravest knights of the Round Table, Arthur looked him in the eyes. He did not see a mercenary or a simple adventurer, but a man of noble heart. He saw a pure spirit, an unwavering strength, and a soul that seemed made for greatness. Arthur, a man of great intuition and nobility, offered Lancelot a place at the Round Table. This was not a simple gesture of welcome, it was a recognition of the valor and honor that Lancelot had demonstrated. By joining the knights, Lancelot not only found a purpose but also a brotherhood. He sat at the Round Table, the symbol of equality and camaraderie, and swore his loyalty to Arthur, to Queen Guinevere, and to the ideal of Camelot. This oath was not a formality. For a knight like Lancelot, it was a sacred promise. He swore to defend the king and the kingdom with his life, to fight for justice and to protect the innocent. Quickly, Lancelot became the champion of Camelot. In tournaments, his skill was so overwhelming that he often allowed his opponents a chance, out of simple courtesy. On the battlefield, his bravery was legendary. He faced enemies that would make others tremble, and he always emerged victorious. His name was sung throughout the kingdom, and the people loved him. There was no knight more loyal, braver, or nobler than Lancelot of the Lake. He was Arthur's right-hand man, the beacon of the Round Table. But in the midst of all this glory and honor, there was an encounter that would change everything. It was a silent encounter, a glance that lasted only an instant, but that would echo through time. It was with Queen Guinevere, Arthur's wife. Upon seeing her, something ignited in his heart. It was not just the queen's beauty, but the nobility of her spirit, the grace of her presence. In that moment, in the heart of the kingdom he had sworn to defend, a forbidden love was born. A love that would defy all his vows, test his honor, and ultimately become the greatest drama in the history of Camelot. The seed of tragedy had already been planted, and not even the greatest of knights could prevent the harvest. From the moment their eyes met, an invisible thread wove itself between Lancelot and Queen Guinevere. It was a love born of duty and desire, a paradox that would define their lives. Lancelot had sworn his fealty to King Arthur, a man he deeply admired and respected. Yet, his heart, once as pure as the lake from which he came, was now irrevocably drawn to his king's wife. Guinevere, in turn, found in Lancelot not just a knight of unparalleled skill, but a soul of profound goodness and sensitivity, a man who saw her not just as a queen but as a woman. Their relationship was, at first, a silent one. They communicated through stolen glances across the great hall, through hushed whispers in the gardens of Camelot, and through the unspoken understanding that existed between them. Lancelot's devotion to her became his guiding star. He wore her colors in tournaments, and every victory he won, every enemy he defeated, was a tribute to her. His incredible feats of bravery, once born of his pure desire for justice, were now also fueled by a need to prove himself worthy of her secret affection. This clandestine affair, however, cast a long shadow. It forced Lancelot to live a double life. By day he was the flawless champion of Camelot, the king's most trusted friend and a symbol of all that was noble and true. By night, he was a man tormented by his own heart, a knight who had broken the most sacred of his vows. This internal conflict ate away at him. He knew his love for Guinevere was an act of profound betrayal, a sin against his king, his country, and the very ideals of the Round Table. Guinevere was equally torn. She loved Arthur, her king, her husband, a man who had brought peace and prosperity to the land. But her soul was bound to Lancelot. She was trapped in a gilded cage of her own making, torn between her duty to the crown and her passion for the knight. Their love was a delicate secret, a fragile flame burning in the heart of Camelot. And so, their bond grew in the shadows, nurtured by forbidden glances and shared secrets. It was a love story that was beautiful in its intensity, but tragic in its impossibility. They were two people destined for each other, yet trapped by the very honor they held so dear. This was not a simple affair, but the foundation of a great tragedy, the love that would bring the greatest kingdom the world had ever known to its knees. In the years that followed his arrival, Lancelot solidified his position as the undisputed champion of Camelot. His name became a legend in its own time. In tournaments he was a force of nature. He unhorsed knights with a single lance thrust and wielded his sword with a speed and precision that few could match. He fought not only with strength but with a grace that made his victories seem effortless. The crowds roared his name, and the other knights of the Round Table looked upon him with a mixture of awe and respect. Beyond the tournament grounds, Lancelot was Arthur's most trusted general and his greatest asset on the battlefield. He led armies against invading forces, defending the borders of the kingdom with unmatched ferocity. He rescued besieged castles, liberated captive towns, and defeated monstrous creatures that terrorized the land. His bravery was a constant source of inspiration for his fellow knights. Wherever Lancelot went, victory seemed to follow. King Arthur relied on him completely. Lancelot was his counsel, his right hand, and the personification of the chivalric ideal. The king saw in him the very best of what the Round Table stood for: loyalty, courage, and honor. Arthur lavished him with gifts and praise, unaware that the one person he trusted most was harboring a secret that would shatter their world. Yet even in his glory, Lancelot was a man of contrasts. His skill in battle was legendary, but he was also a man of deep humility and piety. He would often withdraw to a secluded place to pray, seeking to reconcile his sinful love with his sacred duty. He was a perfect knight in the eyes of the world, but in his heart he knew he was flawed. He was a symbol of Camelot's greatness, but his secret love was also a ticking clock, counting down the moments until the kingdom's inevitable downfall. The kingdom prospered under Arthur's wise rule, and Lancelot's strength and loyalty were a cornerstone of that prosperity. Camelot was at its golden age, a beacon of hope and a model for all other nations. The Knights of the Round Table were a fellowship of heroes, led by a legendary king and his even more legendary champion. But below the surface of this shimmering utopia, a fatal flaw lay dormant. A single, profound betrayal that, when revealed, would bring all of this crashing down. As Camelot basked in its golden age, a new, more profound challenge presented itself: the quest for the Holy Grail. This was not a quest for fame or glory, but a spiritual journey, a search for the purest of all artifacts, the cup from which Jesus Christ drank at the Last Supper. The Grail was said to grant enlightenment and bring those who found it closer to God. The call to this quest rang throughout the kingdom, a test of faith and purity for every knight of the Round Table. Lancelot, the champion of Camelot and the epitome of chivalry, was one of the first to swear the oath. He departed with the other knights, filled with a desperate hope. He saw the quest as a path to redemption, a chance to cleanse his soul of the sin that had stained it. He longed to prove his worthiness not just as a knight but as a man of faith. But the Grail was not meant for him. His journey was a torment of spiritual trials and harsh revelations. He performed great acts of bravery and kindness, but his heart remained clouded by his forbidden love for Guinevere. He could not escape the knowledge that his love, while pure in its own way, was a profound betrayal of his king and his God. This internal conflict was a weight he could not cast off. Legends tell of his failure. In one account he was shown a vision of the Grail, but when he tried to approach it, he was struck down by an unseen force, his body rendered motionless, a punishment for his impurity. The vision was a painful reminder that his spiritual journey was blocked by his mortal sin. He was the greatest knight in the world, capable of conquering any physical foe, but he could not conquer his own heart. The very quality that made him so human, his love for Guinevere, was the very thing that made him unworthy of the divine. While others, like the pure-hearted Galahad, who some say was Lancelot's son, were granted a vision of the Grail, Lancelot was left with only failure. He returned to Camelot a changed man. His outward perfection remained, but his spirit was bruised, his hope of spiritual redemption shattered. He had faced his greatest trial and had been found wanting. The failure of the Grail quest was a harbinger of the tragedy to come. It was the first sign that Lancelot's secret, and the love that fueled it, would not only corrupt him but bring ruin to all of Camelot. As Lancelot struggled with the weight of his spiritual failure, a new element of discord entered the court of Camelot. It was the return of Sir Gawain, a knight of great courage and strength, but also one with a passionate and often vengeful nature. Gawain was loyal to Arthur and the ideal of the Round Table, but he was also deeply proud and easily moved to anger by any slight against his family or his honor. Gawain had a complex relationship with Lancelot. He had long admired Lancelot's prowess, but he also harbored a deep-seated envy of the champion's popularity and his close relationship with the king. This envy, like a slow-burning fuse, was fanned by whispers and rumors that began to circulate through the court. The secret of Lancelot and Guinevere, once a carefully guarded secret, was becoming an open secret, a subject of hushed conversations and knowing glances. While Arthur remained oblivious, trusting his queen and his greatest knight implicitly, Gawain's suspicions grew. He saw the stolen glances, the subtle intimacies, and his loyalty to the king was slowly poisoned by jealousy and indignation. He was a knight of unwavering loyalty to Arthur, and to him, any betrayal of the king was the highest of crimes. The tension between the two knights was subtle at first, a coldness in their interactions, a distance where there once was camaraderie. But as Gawain's suspicion turned to certainty, his envy turned to hatred. He saw Lancelot not as a friend, but as a serpent in the heart of Camelot, a traitor who had defiled the honor of the king and the purity of the Round Table. Gawain's presence at court, his growing animosity toward Lancelot, created a rift in the fellowship. The knights began to take sides, some loyal to Arthur, others feeling that Lancelot's deeds outweighed his private failings. This division, a fracture in the very foundation of Camelot, was a critical turning point. It was a sign that the unity Arthur had so painstakingly built was beginning to crumble. The stage was being set for the final act of this tragic drama, and Gawain, with his burning sense of betrayal, was destined to play the role of the accuser. His anger would be the spark that lit the flame of the kingdom's destruction. While Lancelot and Gawain's silent feud festered, a more insidious force was at work within Camelot's walls. This was the treachery of Mordred, King Arthur's illegitimate son and, according to prophecy, the harbinger of his doom. Mordred was a knight of the Round Table, but his heart was filled with a bitter jealousy and a hunger for power. He had long coveted his father's throne and resented Lancelot's position as Arthur's most trusted friend and champion. He saw Lancelot not as a rival but as an obstacle to be removed. Mordred's mind was as sharp as it was devious. He had observed the subtle glances and stolen moments between Lancelot and Queen Guinevere. He recognized the profound love that existed between them, and he knew that this secret was the kingdom's greatest weakness. Unlike others who saw the affair as a moral failing, Mordred saw it as a strategic opportunity. He planned to use it as a weapon to destroy Lancelot and in doing so, topple his father's reign. He began to feed the rumors, whispering falsehoods and exaggerations into the ears of those already suspicious. He manipulated Sir Agravain and other knights who harbored a grudge against Lancelot, convincing them that it was their duty to expose the betrayal and restore the king's honor. He framed the act not as an act of personal ambition, but as a righteous mission to cleanse Camelot of its sin. Mordred's plot was meticulous. He convinced Arthur to go on a hunting trip, leaving the court undefended and providing the perfect opportunity to catch the lovers in the act. He then positioned his men to lie in wait, ready to storm the queen's chambers. His goal was not just to reveal the truth, but to do so in a way that would force Arthur's hand and make a peaceful resolution impossible. He wanted bloodshed and chaos, the very ingredients needed for a kingdom's downfall. This was the ultimate act of betrayal. Mordred, the son, was poised to betray his father, using the deep love between his father's queen and his best knight as the instrument of his destruction. The stage was now set for the final, tragic confrontation. The secret that had been the foundation of Camelot's most beautiful romance was about to become the tool of its final, irreversible ruin. The trap was sprung. As night fell and a false sense of security settled over Camelot, Lancelot, ever trusting, came to Guinevere's chambers. He was unaware that outside, Mordred's men, led by Sir Agravain, were lying in wait. In a thunderous moment, the doors to the queen's chambers were smashed open. Lancelot, caught off guard and unarmed, was faced with a mob of knights ready to apprehend him and expose his shame. In an instant, the years of hidden love and stolen glances came to a violent end. The secret that had been guarded for so long was revealed to the world. Lancelot, with only his immense strength and a single sword he managed to grab, fought his way out, killing Sir Agravain and several other knights in the process. His escape was a desperate act, a bloody and irreversible stain on his honor. The news spread through the kingdom like wildfire. The queen's indiscretion and the king's best knight's treachery were now public knowledge. The illusion of a perfect, noble Camelot was shattered. The people were shocked, the knights were divided, and the ideals of the Round Table were broken. The very foundations of the kingdom, built on loyalty and honor, began to crack. When King Arthur received the news, his world crumbled. He had built his kingdom on trust and love, and now both had been betrayed by the two people closest to him. His grief was immense, but as a king he was bound by law. The law of the land, which he himself had championed, decreed that a queen found guilty of adultery must be burned at the stake. There could be no mercy, no turning back. The revelation of the affair was not a quiet, private moment. It was a public spectacle, a brutal and violent unmasking. It forced every character to make a choice. Arthur, the grieving king, was now also the enforcer of a cruel law. Lancelot, the honorable knight, was now a fugitive and a murderer. And Guinevere, the queen, was now a condemned criminal. The golden age of Camelot had come to a definitive end, replaced by the grim reality of betrayal and the promise of impending war. With Lancelot a fugitive and his great secret laid bare, the full weight of the law fell upon Queen Guinevere. The betrayal of a queen was not merely a personal matter, it was an act of high treason against the kingdom itself. The laws that King Arthur had established, the very principles of justice and order he had championed, now demanded her death. She was arrested and brought to trial, a solemn and terrible spectacle for all of Camelot to witness. Arthur, though his heart was broken, had no choice but to enforce the law. To do otherwise would be to undermine the very foundation of his rule. The king who had brought justice to the land could not be seen to bend his own laws for a personal matter, no matter how great his love and grief. He was a king first and a man second, and in this moment his duty was a heavy chain. The verdict was inevitable. Guinevere was found guilty of adultery and sentenced to be burned at the stake. A pyre was constructed, a grim symbol of the end of Camelot's golden age. The knights of the Round Table, their fellowship fractured, were forced to take sides. Some, like the noble Sir Gawain, felt that the law must be upheld, even if it meant the death of the queen. Others were consumed by grief and indecision, torn between their loyalty to the king and their personal affections for Lancelot and the queen. On the day of the execution, a grim procession led Guinevere to the pyre. The crowds watched in a stunned silence, unable to comprehend how a love story that had bloomed in the shadows could now lead to such a public and brutal end. As the flames were being prepared, a final desperate hope lingered in the air. The kingdom held its breath, wondering if the man who had loved her so fiercely would allow her to meet such a terrible fate. As the flames began to lick at the wood and Guinevere was bound for her final moments, a distant sound echoed across the fields, the thunderous gallop of horses. The crowd gasped, and the knights on guard prepared for the inevitable. Lancelot had returned. He could not stand by and watch the woman he loved, the woman for whom he had already sacrificed his honor, be consumed by fire. He was no longer just the champion of Camelot, he was a desperate man fighting for his life and his love. He burst into the scene, a whirlwind of steel and fury. He was no longer the graceful jouster, but a warrior fighting with a singular, bloody purpose. His sword cut a path through the knights guarding the pyre, and in his desperation he did not distinguish friend from foe. In the chaos of the moment, several of Arthur's most loyal and beloved knights, including Sir Gareth and Sir Gaheris, were killed by Lancelot's hand. This act was not a choice but a tragic accident, a result of the frenzy of battle. But it was an accident that would have devastating consequences. Lancelot freed Guinevere and mounted her on his horse. Together they fled the scene, leaving behind a kingdom in shambles and a king heartbroken by the death of his knights and the final, public confirmation of his greatest betrayal. Their escape was a victory, but it was a victory forged in blood. The deaths of Gareth and Gaheris, who were close kin to Sir Gawain, turned Gawain's quiet anger into a burning, unquenchable thirst for revenge. This act transformed the affair from a court scandal into a full-blown civil war. The bond between Arthur and Lancelot was completely severed. The king, now a grieving father figure to his fallen knights, could no longer see Lancelot as a friend. He could only see him as a traitor, a murderer, and the man who had brought ruin to his kingdom. Lancelot and Guinevere had won their freedom, but at a price that would cost everyone everything. After the bloody rescue, Lancelot and Guinevere fled from Camelot, a kingdom no longer their home. They were now exiles, fugitives from the very land Lancelot had sworn to protect. Lancelot returned to his own lands across the sea in France, taking the queen with him. There he established a new fortress, a place where he could defend his love and the remnants of his broken honor. Their life in exile was one of constant vigilance. Lancelot was no longer the lauded champion of the Round Table but a king in his own right, surrounded by the loyal knights who had chosen to follow him rather than stay with Arthur. Yet even with a kingdom of his own he was a man consumed by grief. The deaths of Sir Gareth and Sir Gaheris weighed heavily on his conscience. He knew his actions, though born of a desperate love, had caused a deep and unhealable wound in the heart of the man he once called his brother. Guinevere too was changed. The queen of a glorious kingdom was now a woman in hiding, a constant reminder of the tragedy that had unraveled her old life. Their love, which had once seemed so beautiful and passionate in its secrecy, now carried the heavy burden of the lives lost and the kingdom shattered. It was a love that had become the catalyst for a civil war. The separation of Lancelot and Guinevere from Camelot was not just a physical distance. It was the final, devastating split of the fellowship. The Round Table was now a broken circle, its members divided into factions loyal to either Arthur or Lancelot. The unity that Arthur had painstakingly built over a lifetime was gone, replaced by a bitter and irreparable rift. The golden age of Camelot had definitively ended, replaced by the grim reality of a nation at war with itself. Enraged by the deaths of his kin and the betrayal of his most trusted knight, King Arthur, with the full support of Sir Gawain, could not let the matter rest. His grief turned to a bitter resolve. He gathered his armies and crossed the sea to lay siege to Lancelot's fortress in France. This was not just a political conflict, it was a personal war between two men who had once been like brothers. The war was a terrible and bloody affair. Former comrades, men who had fought side by side against dragons and invading armies, now stood as enemies on opposite sides of the battlefield. The battle lines were drawn between loyalty and betrayal, duty and love. Lancelot, though a fearsome warrior, fought with a heavy heart. He deliberately held back, ordering his men not to harm King Arthur, refusing to raise his sword against the man he still respected and loved. But Gawain's thirst for vengeance knew no bounds. He challenged Lancelot to single combat, a duel he believed would avenge his brothers and restore his family's honor. The duel was a showcase of two of the greatest knights of their era. They fought with a ferocity born of a deeply personal hatred and a shared, tragic past. Lancelot, despite being the superior swordsman, still fought with a measure of restraint. He was able to defeat Gawain, but instead of killing him, he spared his life, a final act of mercy towards the man who wanted nothing more than his death. The war dragged on, consuming the last vestiges of the knight's nobility and purpose. The great fellowship of the Round Table was now a collection of warring factions, each battle a painful reminder of what they had lost. The siege of Lancelot's fortress became a stalemate, a brutal, unending struggle with no clear victor. But as Arthur and Lancelot were locked in their bitter conflict, a new and far greater threat was rising back home in Camelot, a threat that would make their war seem trivial in comparison. While Arthur and Lancelot, the two fractured pillars of the kingdom, were consumed in an absurd war abroad, a far more insidious threat was rising in the heart of Britain. The traitor Mordred, King Arthur's illegitimate son, had been left in charge of the kingdom, a position of trust he had no intention of honoring. With the king, his only real threat, and the most loyal knights away, the perfect opportunity presented itself. Through cunning and calculated deceit, Mordred began spreading false rumors of Arthur's death in battle, a lie that spread like a plague throughout the kingdom. He was a master of manipulation. He played on the discontent of nobles who resented Arthur's absolute power and the weariness of the common people, tired of the costly and seemingly endless war with Lancelot. Mordred was no hero, but he presented himself as a savior, the new leader who would end the war and restore peace to a torn nation. He proclaimed himself king amidst public acclamation, consolidating his power with alarming speed. To seal his usurpation and completely humiliate his father, he attempted a final act of desecration, to force Queen Guinevere to marry him, an act that symbolized the triumph of betrayal over legitimacy. News of Mordred's treachery reached Arthur and Lancelot as a devastating blow. The war they had been waging, the vengeance for which they had sacrificed their brotherhood, suddenly felt empty and meaningless. They realized, with heartbreaking pain, that while they were destroying each other over a forbidden love, the kingdom they both loved was being stolen by a true enemy. The bitterness of their personal conflict vanished, replaced by a common and urgent goal. The enemy was no longer each other but the traitor who had manipulated their passions for his own gain. In a moment of supreme clarity and grief, Arthur met Lancelot in a precarious truce. In that meeting, Lancelot, repentant and aware of the gravity of the situation, offered Arthur his unconditional help. He offered his armies, his experience in war and his loyalty, all that he had left, to help the king reclaim what was his. But Arthur's wound was too deep. Pride, pain, and betrayal still clung to his heart. He refused Lancelot's help, choosing to face his destiny alone. And so, King Arthur, with the few men he had left, sailed back to Britain, leaving Lancelot behind to suffer the consequences of his own choice. The last bond that united them was broken, and the king who had begun his reign with a hand extended toward the future, was now heading toward his end, alone and betrayed. The stage for the final act of Camelot's tragedy was set on a bleak and desolate field. The Battle of Camelot would not be a glorious clash of armies, it would be a cataclysmic event that marked the end of an era. It was the final confrontation between King Arthur and the army of his son, Mordred. The air was charged not only with the tension of war but with a profound sadness, as men on both sides were countrymen, often friends who were now forced to face each other for a lost cause. The code of chivalry that Arthur had founded vanished in the frenzy of battle. It was a brutal slaughter, a desperate fight for survival rather than a quest for glory. Men fought to exhaustion, driven by desperation and rage. In the midst of the chaos, Arthur, with immense fury and grief, spotted Mordred. The father and son, the embodiment of order and chaos, engaged in a personal duel that would define the end of the legend. With the legendary sword Excalibur in his hand, Arthur struck at his son. His blow was mortal. The sword pierced Mordred's armor and delivered the final blow. But Mordred, with his last breath, responded with a final, treacherous thrust. His sword pierced Arthur, mortally wounding him. Both men fell to the ground at the same moment, the king and his traitor, the ideal and its destruction. The battlefield became silent, only the echo of death resonating in the air. With Arthur's fall, the war came to an end. But there was no victor. The Battle of Camelot was not a victory for anyone, it was the definitive end. The great dream of Camelot had been reduced to a battlefield littered with corpses, a grim monument to the fall of the noblest ideals. The Knights of the Round Table, the most powerful and united force the world had known, were now scattered, dead or broken. The battle had consumed not only the men but the very soul of the kingdom. With its king fallen and its legacy in ruins, Arthur's kingdom no longer existed except in the annals of history. As the last rays of light faded from the sky over the battlefield of Camelot, the great King Arthur lay dying. Mortally wounded, he was carried by the few knights who remained to the shore of a misty lake. His body was bleeding, his breath grew weak, but his mind still clung to one last act of will. The sword Excalibur, the symbol of his divine right to rule, lay at his side, its glow now tarnished by tragedy. With an agonizing whisper, Arthur gave his last loyal knight, Sir Bedivere, the final command. He was to return the sacred sword to the Lady of the Lake. Bedivere, his heart shattered, hesitated. He could not bear the thought of casting the symbol of his king and kingdom into the depths. But Arthur insisted, his will unwavering even in death. Bedivere obeyed. He cast the sword into the lake, and a magical hand, the same hand that had offered it to Arthur, rose from the waters, caught the sword, and drew it into the depths, returning the mystical power to its place of origin. Arthur, now free from his destiny, was taken to the mythical island of Avalon, a place of rest for great kings, where his legend became a myth. But for those who were left behind, his death marked a turning point. It was not Lancelot's betrayal nor Mordred's rebellion that ended the era, but the passing of the man who had been the heart and soul of everything. Arthur's death was not the end of a reign, but the end of an idea. With him, died the hope of a perfect kingdom, a noble dream of chivalry, justice, and honor that had been corrupted by human passions and jealousy. Those who remained were scattered, taking with them only the bitter memory of what could have been. King Arthur, the man who united a nation, became a legend awaiting his return, but in the hearts of all, they knew that his reign and the glory that came with it was lost forever. News of Arthur's death and the destruction of Camelot reached Lancelot and Guinevere as the last and most devastating of all tragedies. Years after their physical separation, the man and woman who had unleashed the end of the kingdom met one final time. But this was not a meeting of passionate lovers but of two broken and repentant souls. The passion that had united them had transformed into a profound sorrow, a constant reminder of the price they had paid for their love. In that final meeting, Lancelot and Guinevere made the most difficult decision of their lives, to renounce each other forever. There was no future for them. Their love had brought ruin to everyone around them, and the only path to redemption was penitence and solitude. They separated without a kiss, without a touch, only with a glance that contained all the pain and regret in the world. Guinevere, the queen who once ruled Camelot with grace, retired to a convent. She renounced her name and her past, dedicating the rest of her days to prayer and humility. Behind the veil, the world would remember her as a fallen queen, but in the solitude of her cell, she saw herself as a woman who had lost everything for love and now sought peace in God. Lancelot, for his part, became a hermit. He renounced chivalry, cast off his armor, and lived the rest of his life in solitude, praying and fasting. The greatest of knights, the champion of the kingdom, was now a simple man on his knees, begging for forgiveness for his betrayal. Every prayer was for the soul of his king, for the knights he had inadvertently killed, and for the woman he still loved. The glory of his life had been replaced by the burden of his conscience. Their separation was the final act of their love story. It was a supreme sacrifice, a silent acknowledgement that their love, no matter how true, could not exist in the world. The greatest of lovers in all of legend had been separated by the tragic reality of the consequences of their actions, each seeking peace on a solitary path of repentance. Lancelot, the man who was once the soul of Camelot, died in the solitude of his cell. It was not in an epic battle, nor in the heat of a duel, but in silence as an ordinary man. The legendary warrior who had defeated dragons and armies left this world as a simple penitent, his mind filled with regret. His body was carried back to his fortress overseas, where he was buried alongside the loyal knights who had followed him. His tomb became a monument to lost greatness, the final resting place of the man who had been the noblest of knights and at the same time, the catalyst for the fall of his kingdom. Lancelot's legacy is a paradox. He was a man of immense honor who broke the most sacred of vows. He was the champion who brought glory to his kingdom and the traitor who destroyed it. His story is a reminder that the most powerful force is not the sword but the human heart. The love, passion, and error of a single man could bring down a kingdom built on the noblest foundations. He was not a simple hero or a villain but a reflection of human complexity. He was the last knight, the last hope, and, finally, the last link in the chain that was broken forever. With his death, the dream of Camelot finally vanished, and the era of the Round Table became a whisper in history. And so, the legend of Camelot came to its end. It was not a singular act of betrayal, nor a great battle that brought the kingdom down. It was the slow, painful erosion from within, the inevitable failure of an ideal in the face of human nature's reality. Arthur's kingdom was not destroyed by external enemies but by the passions of its own heroes. The love that blossomed between Lancelot and Guinevere, so beautiful and so forbidden, was the catalyst that broke the fragile balance of a kingdom that, for all its greatness, was ultimately human. The story of Lancelot and Guinevere is not just a love story but a lesson in the imperfection of virtue. It teaches us that even the noblest of men can be brought down by passion, and that the greatest strengths can hold the seeds of their own destruction. Arthur's legacy endures in the tales, a reminder of the golden age and the tragic fall. But the final echo of that era belongs to Lancelot, the knight who had everything and lost it for love, the hero who brought glory and finally ruin. He was the last knight, and with his last breath, the great dream of Camelot vanished forever, leaving only the memory of a lost kingdom and a love that ruined the world.